There we go.
Okay, now I think it's recording. So thanks once again to Professor James Lennox for his availability to come joining us for this meeting. There are some people here that participate in this group. We meet regularly each Monday to discuss topics on philosophy and biology. We are at the Instituto de Biociências from the University of São Paulo. And there are also here some people that we are knowing today that come mostly from philosophy departments. So it's really an honor to have James Lennox here. As it is an informal meeting, I won't describe the whole CV of Professor Lennox. If I did it so, we would take half an hour, right? But I would just say that Professor Lennox is PhD by the University of Toronto. And if I'm not mistaken, he teaches in the University of Pittsburgh since 1978, where he's actually a professor emeritus. Amongst his several works, I would like to highlight the books he published: Aristotle's Philosophy of Biology from 2001, and the translation of On the Part of the Animals at the same year, and a book that was published this year, 2021, Aristotle on Inquiry, Erotetic Frameworks and Domain-Specific Norms. So Professor Lennox works with some topics that are really interesting for our group, such as Aristotle's biology, Darwinism, Darwin's biology, and the history of science and philosophy of science. So Professor Lennox will say some words as an introduction, and then we will open to an open discussion based on the talk by Professor Lennox and on both texts that we sent by email, an Aristotelian philosophy of biology and Aristotle and Darwin. So thank you once again, Professor Lennox.
Thank you very much. Yeah, let me just, this will take probably only 10 minutes or so, but I thought a worthwhile introduction would be to say something about how I see the two papers that I sent to you being related to one another. Uh, there's some obvious relationships and maybe some that aren't quite so obvious. And I thought where I would start is a point I make at the beginning of the second section of an Aristotelian philosophy of biology. I point out that Aristotle starts his metaphysics, as we call it. It's his work where he's searching for the highest form of wisdom, first philosophy, as he sometimes calls it. And the very first sentence is quite famous. All human beings by nature desire to know. But he goes on to say that evidence of this is the delight we take in our senses, and especially perception, visual perception, because he says visual perception gives us the greatest knowledge of differences. And I point out there that this is really more revolutionary than perhaps people in our era can understand. But it really was revolutionary and unprecedented, because up until Aristotle, virtually every philosopher, regardless of whether they were idealistic like the Pythagoreans and Plato or materialistic like Democritus, all of them said that the senses deceived us. The senses gave us unreliable information about the natural world. And all of them argued that you should try and understand the world by finding some eternal, changeless entity. And then explain all of the appearances, the deceptive appearances, by relating those deceptive appearances to these unchanging eternal beings of some kind or other. They might be Platonic forms, they might be Pythagorean numbers, they might be atoms, they might be one or more of the basic elements, but knowledge was of those eternal and unchanging entities that lay behind the visual appearances. So when Aristotle says this, it's really revolutionary, that it's the knowledge of differences, it's the knowledge of diversity in the natural world that is reliable and which we should base our understanding of the world on. And this is really reflected in his biological practice. The Historia Animalium, a huge work, is based on a study of 4 different kinds of differences. Differences in the parts of animals, differences in the way they generate, differences in the ways of life that are exemplified in their activities, and differences in their characters. And so the Historia Animalium is really a study of animal differences, the way animals differ from one another. And that work begins by laying out a number of levels of difference. Animals can differ by analogy, they can differ in kind, they can differ in the various forms of those kinds, or they can differ within the forms, individual differences within the forms. So he starts with differences, and the whole work is structured around the way animals are differentiated from one another. And as I say, I stress this because it's something that it's hard for us to realize, I think, sometimes just how revolutionary that was. So that's something I stress in the Aristotelian philosophy of biology paper, but it's really the focus of the way in which I see affinities between Aristotle and Darwin in the Aristotle and Darwin paper. It's the fact that they both focus on variation in the natural world. Darwin, of course, makes use of that variation as the material on which natural selection operates, but Aristotle and Darwin are both absolutely fascinated by the diversity and variation and differences that we find in the animal kingdom. Another relationship which you can see in the second section of an Aristotelian philosophy of biology is that I focus in both papers on what Aristotle calls more and less variations. So he sees what we might call species of a genus, what he would call forms of a kind, as related by these more and less differences. So all cephalopods, for example, will have 8 arms. And those will differ from one species to another in being longer or shorter, being wider or narrower, having 2 suckers on each arm or 1 sucker on each arm. But these are more and less differences among all of the cephalopods. That's the way they vary within the wider kind. And that's just a way, and using the cephalopods as my example in both papers, it's just a way of giving you a concrete example of his fascination with the way in which animals within a wider kind vary along these continuous variations. Two more things with respect to that paper and how it relates to the Aristotle and Darwin paper. One is, and I'll just read this out. This is, if you have the paper in front of you, this is on page 14 of the PDF, which I think is page 40 of the paper. Aristotle has told us that there is a parallel kind-form structure in animal activities and animal parts. We're about to see that this parallelism underwrites one of the explanatory projects at the heart of Aristotelian biology, using the differences in animals' functional activities to explain the differences in an animal's morphological features. In effect, the project of functional morphology, as we will see in the final section of the paper. And that just sends you to the closing part of the paper, where I talk about the organismal biologists in the early part of the 20th century and how their project is being revived by a number of biologists and philosophers of biology in the last 10 years or so. And then finally, in that paper, and I'll just scroll down here a little bit. There's one other passage I want to stress because I think it helps see how these two papers are related. And it's at the in the closing section of that paper, when I talk about how little difference I think the fact that we live in an evolutionary biological world makes to the relevance of Aristotle's biology. So I say it was not evolutionary perspective per se that led philosophers such as David Hull or biologists such as Ernst Mayr to see an enormous gulf between Aristotle and evolutionary biology. It was the sort of evolutionary biology that emerged from the synthesis of Mendelian genetics and mathematical selection theory, an evolutionary biology that disintegrated whole animals into a collection of independent traits clustering in design space, that thought of populations of organisms as gene pools, and that treated generation as ultimately irrelevant, since evolution was simply a shift in the frequencies of genes in gene pools due to selection acting on independent phenotypic traits. And when I was in graduate school, that was the way in which evolutionary biology was taught to me. I know it sounds rather outdated today, what with Evo Devo having come along, but trust me, in the late 1970s, that was evolutionary biology, and that's the way, as a philosopher of biology, that's the way evolutionary biologists taught us to think about biology. Okay, so I think that just sort of sets up the discussion by way of suggesting some of the ways in which that paper is related to the paper on Aristotle and Darwin. And that second paper, of course, is centered around what I call the antagonistic myth that there's a complete, it's impossible to imagine any kind of rapprochement between an Aristotelian way of thinking about living things and a Darwinian or evolutionary way of thinking about things. I think that is a complete myth, but we can talk more about that.
Great. Thank you, Professor Lennox, for this articulation between these two very interesting works. And so now we can proceed to the discussion. I suggest that anyone who wants to make a question or a comment raise his or her hand, in order for us to proceed. So I have a lot of questions, but I will try to refrain myself for beginning. So I don't know if Maria Alice, if you want to.
I was just, Tiago and Claudia wrote something there. I don't know if they want to put as questions to Professor Lennox.
I think these were the passages that Professor Lennox read in the text. Is this it? I think they copied it on the chat. Is this it?
Okay.
So I'm sure a lot of people have questions, but I don't know who wants to start. Perhaps you, Maria Alice?
I may start just to bring about to bring Roberto de Andrade Martins, that is here with us today. And to tell you, Professor Lennox, that I really enjoy to read your text, especially this one approaching Darwin and Aristotle, because the myths you mentioned, and because it reading it, I understood why I understand Aristotle in a different way these people used to understand. And the reason is that the two reasons are here with us today. One is you, and another is Roberto Martins, because I read your texts back there when I start studying history of biology, and I know from your works that this mythological conception on Aristotle was really a myth. It was mythological. So it's just something to approach you. And I invite Roberto, if you want to put some, if you want to make the real first question, please go on.
Thank you, Maria Alice, and thank you very much, Professor Lennox, for you being here, and we are being able now to hear you, not only to read your papers. And
Great pleasure.
yes, one first question is, there's a difference between diversity and variation, in my view, because
Yes.
variation is variation in time, I think, at least when we read Darwin's Variation of Animals and Species, his book, I think he's always thinking that things are changing all the time, and this makes the opportunity for evolution. Now, when Aristotle talks about the diversity of animals of some kind, etc., I think he's talking about diversity, okay, but not a change. Only in the case you point out concerning the generation of animals, is clearly referring to a change in time, because there may be some difference between the offspring and the parents and things like that. But I wonder if we can also expand his view of variation in the generation of animals to his view about diversity in general.
Good. That's a really, really good question. I agree with you that Aristotle is not primarily focused on the sorts of, as Darwin would say, slight, minuscule variations that he thinks are actually the materials for natural selection, materials for evolutionary change. However, it's clear that he's aware of those differences and even is happy to offer explanations of them. I'll give a couple of examples in a moment. The point I make at the end of the Aristotle and Darwin paper about them being millennia and worlds apart, I think is directly relevant to your question. In order to see that those kinds of tiny fluctuate, as Aristotle says, or as Darwin says, fluctuating variations are actually biologically important, you need some reason to think that that's where your attention should focus. Now, Darwin comes at the end of about 150 years of exploration of the world by colonial naturalists going out all over the world and discovering biogeographic diversity that nobody had any reason to expect, noticing that biogeographic regions seem to be very different from one region to the next, noticing that the fossil record in each of those regions is closely related to the animals in those regions, but not to animals in other regions. Once you start getting a handle on that, you realize it looks like these organisms are related in a more serious way than just by observed similarity. It looks like they're genetically related. It looks like they're related biologically to one another. And at that point, I think people begin, and it was long before Darwin, if you look at Lamarck's zoology, philosophie zoologique, he is doing exactly the same thing that Darwin is doing. He's starting to look at domestic breeding and domestic populations and figuring out how breeders create distinct breeds from a common stock. And once you start thinking about that kind of thing, then those little teeny individual differences start to become important. They start to become something you should focus on. But I don't think anybody was focusing on them until the late 18th century. I mean, virtually every biologist up until Buffon and Lamarck and Sennelier and Erasmus Darwin and these people, up until then, everyone was inclined to think that those are just variations that fluctuate from one generation to the next, but the organisms keep reproducing after their kind. And that's the important thing, that they keep reproducing after their kind. So while I agree with you completely that one shouldn't elide the difference between diversity on the one hand and the fluctuating variation in populations on the other hand, I think that it becomes important to focus on that only once an evolutionary scenario becomes a plausible idea. Now, I will point out that Book 5 of Aristotle's Generation of Animals is almost entirely focused on what we would call subspecific fluctuating variations. He's focusing on why it is that apparently the same kind of sheep has a different kind of wool on one side of a mountain versus on the other side of a mountain, and why it is that some people lose their hair and go bald as they get older and other people don't, and why it is that some people have curly black hair and other people have straight blonde hair. And so he's fully aware of those kinds of differences. And I wanted to stress that contrary to what Elliot Sober would lead you to believe, he doesn't think these kinds of variations are due to some kind of deviation from type. He thinks this is an ordinary and natural part of populations. He just doesn't think those kinds of variations are important for a scientific researcher to focus on, because they are fluctuating variations. They're the ways in which offspring differ from their parents and the way in which brothers and sisters differ from one another. But he didn't see that as an important part of the biological project. Once evolution gets on the radar screen, then those small fluctuating variations become very, very important. I think that's a crucial difference between Darwin's way of thinking about living things and Aristotle's. So thank you. I agree. Don't want to confuse diversity in nature and that kind of variation that Darwin was focused on.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, I want to make a question following what Roberto. Well, perhaps you want to talk first, Igor.
Oh, if you want to go first, João, go ahead.
Well, let me just a question that is related to what Professor Roberto was saying about the category. You are talking about diversity and difference, and I wonder if plurality would be also a good word here. I'm thinking about your article for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that we discussed here in another occasion among our group, and you say that Aristotle refuses Plato's dichotomy by non-essential differences, and you talk about multi-differential division. And so I was thinking this diversity and these differences you are talking about make me think about the image of a plurality. Do you think this is a good word describing? Because I'm thinking along the lines of the parallel between metaphysics and biology. I think, for instance, in the pros-hen architecture of concepts by Aristotle, you have one concept and under it a lot of sub-concepts, or we could call it in another way. Do you think plurality would be a nice word here for describing it?
I'm trying to think whether it accomplishes anything that diversity doesn't. So if you focus on the idea of multi-differential division, the idea there is that, you know, if you're dealing with something simple like numbers, you can probably create a division tree of numbers, let's say into odd and even, and get a classification, a nice clean classification of numbers just by dividing them between odd and even. But with organisms, because they have, because they're constituted of an incredible number of different parts, and those parts have different functions, and all of the parts have to be coordinated in a certain way. His thought is you can't divide the way Plato was inclined to. And remember, as background here, in the late Platonic dialogues, Plato seems to have decided that the proper form of dialectic, which remember was Plato's view was first philosophy. That's how you made philosophical progress, by this method of dialectic that he has been talking about since the Republic. In the later dialogues, his idea is it's by use of division that dialectic proceeds. And he does divide the way Aristotle criticizes. He'll say, all right, well, let's say we're trying to find the sophist. Well, let me give you an example from the world of living things, or a simpler example. He says, how about the angler? Well, okay. And then he starts these divisions, and the divisions are always dichotomous. He's either an angler of living things or non-living things, and then he'll say, okay, and if he's trying to catch fish, he's either doing it with nets or with hooks. And if he's trying to do it with hooks, then, and they're all accidentally related. Every division is accidentally related to the one above it. It's not actually a division of the things above it at all. And it's always dichotomous. And the dichotomies are often between A and not A. So that one half of the division is a negation of the other half. And Aristotle says, you're never going to understand living things this way. First of all, living things are made up of many, many, many differences. And how are you going to track all of these differences in a population by division? Well, every line of division, you should start by identifying general characteristics of the kind you're interested in. So if it's birds, wings, two-leggedness, beaks, feathers, and so on. And then under each of those general characteristics, start a division that tracks the number of different kinds of, say, beaks, or different kinds of wings, or different kinds of feathers. It might be just 2, but it might be 5, 10, 50, who knows? And then it should always be a subdivision of the kind of thing that you started with. So if you start with wings, all of your divisions all the way down should be subkinds of wings. If it's feathers, it should all be divisions of into subkinds of feathers. And he says at some point you'll get to the bottom of all of these divisions where you can't divide any further. And he says those will be the indivisible forms of living things that we find around us. I'm not sure that plurality is a word that helps in understanding that. I'm not even sure diversity does, but one way to think about it in philosophical lingo is between determinables and determinants. So this is a common way of sort of thinking about potentiality versus actual reality, if you like, that you've got a general kind, let's say bird, and it's got all these general characteristics that are shared and common to all birds. And then you track the various kinds and subkinds of birds by tracking the way in which you get more and more determinate forms of those general characteristics until you get a particular kind of feather that's a particular kind of length and has particular color and a particular texture and so on and so forth. Yeah, so I guess that was just sort of trying to concretize whether plurality would help. Plurality might help us in getting a handle on the fact that another point I make, Aristotle's not a reductionist. He kind of embraces a plurality of things. It doesn't, he's not interested in trying to explain everything in the world by means of atoms and void, or by means of numbers, or by means of eternal forms or something. He's perfectly happy to embrace a world of living things that just full of difference, full of diversity, full of, so he's a pluralist in that sense, I guess.
Nice, thank you. I think Igor would also make a question.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lennox. I have to say that was a delight for me to read your text as a biologist trying to catch up with philosophy. I have a question regarding the second test that I read about the Aristotelian philosophy of biology, that you mentioned that currently there is a reformation taking place in contemporary biology, that after a century of biology dominated by Darwinian and neo-Darwinian concepts like gene pools and etc., that now biology is returning to its Aristotelian roots. So my question is, why do you consider that it's important that biology would return to Aristotelian roots? Like, I was wondering that you explained in the end of the text that the problem, let's say, with the neo-Darwinians is that they were actually disintegrating the organisms into entities like genes or frequencies of mutations and concepts like that. And you defend, like others, that the organism should be irreducible locus of explanation. So I was curious about that. So why do you think that would be interesting to have this Aristotelian view of biology? Thank you.
No, I think that's a really important question and a very fundamental one. I have two responses to that. One is, and they may seem contradictory, but I don't think they are. I think they're complementary. One is, it really doesn't matter. What matters is we get it right. What matters is that we really do come to a deeper and deeper understanding of the living world. That's what biology should be all about. And how you go about doing that, it doesn't matter what the label is. So the way I think about what I'm doing, and I have really, since I retired, I really have shifted my emphasis towards the way I talk about it sometimes. This is kind of nasty. It's not a nice way to put it, but I'm really just joking. I'm trying to keep the neo-Aristotelians honest. There has been a really growing movement of neo-Aristotelianism in metaphysics. The two areas, there's three areas really: metaphysics, philosophy of science, and ethics. What I worry about in all three areas is, why are these people calling themselves neo-Aristotelians? Because so often the respect in which they're Aristotelian is, it seems to me, very, very thin. It's a veneer. In some cases, I know exactly why it feels that way. What they actually are neo-Thomists. They're Catholics who have been raised in an Aristotelian view of the world, but it's not really an Aristotelian view of the world. It's Thomas Aquinas's view of the world. It's for that reason that they don't sound Aristotelian to me, if you like. It's Aristotelian filtered through Thomas Aquinas and some neo-Thomists in the 20th century. However, what I think deep down is that Aristotle has a metaphysics of life that we can learn a lot from. So partly what I want to do is explain Aristotle's view about living things, his philosophy of biology, if you like, his philosophy of life, in a way that's both true to him. I mean, that's based on a careful reading of Aristotelian texts. And that shows that it has something to offer contemporary biology. And if you look at contemporary biology when I was your age, developmental biology was a completely separate discipline from evolutionary biology. There were people doing embryology, as it was then called, but they weren't part of the neo-Darwinian framework. There were people trying to make it part of the Waddington was trying very hard to make it part of the neo-Darwinian framework, but the neo-Darwinians, for the most part, thought development wasn't really relevant to the big picture of biology, if you like. The same went for functional morphology. There were people doing it, but they weren't part of the Darwinian framework. And you can go through area after area like that. It's stuff that's really important to understanding living things, but it's being ignored. And it's being ignored in the sense that you can go from one biology department to the next in the 1960s and 70s around the world, and what you'll find is a lot of molecular biology going on, a lot of population genetics going on, and a lot of evolutionary biology going on. But why invest in a developmental biologist? We don't need one of them. So I think Aristotle's way of thinking about living things is very, very important to the way biology should be done. I've mentioned a couple of times in that paper, I make reference to Dennis Walsh. He published a book called Organisms, Agency, and Evolution in 2015, I think it was. And what that book does is paint a picture of sort of evolutionary biology as the neo-Darwinians picture it. And then say, look, there's an elephant in the room that they're not getting. There has to be an active living organism. There have to be active individual living organisms struggling for life, actively engaged with their environment, selectively choosing what kinds of foods they should go after and what kinds of or other organisms are predators, and so on and so forth. That is absolutely critical to the operation of natural selection in the real world. But it gets ignored by the sort of neo-Darwinian synthesis. And once you start looking at organisms that way, in my view, you're starting to looking at organisms the way Aristotle looked at organisms, as these entities with ways of life, activities integrated around the way of life that they're living, and their reproductive activity as distinctive to them, and so on. So on the one hand, I'm sort of agree with the, I think, implicit thought behind your question that why does it matter if we call it Aristotelian? I mean, let's just get it right. Yeah, I agree. But I do think sometimes what you need is a new framework for thinking about how to approach biology. And I think Aristotle has a very, very valuable set of lessons to teach us from that perspective.
Thank you.
Maria Edice wrote a question. Perhaps you want to read it and comment on it, Maria Edice?
Yeah, it's, since I can't speak properly in English, I wrote down just to not get messy. So
Your English is much better than my Portuguese.
Yeah. If I understood the question and the answer you gave to Roberto Martins, I was wondering if this shifting from the discussion of the essential, eternal characters to differences like hair color or so on you mentioned, this shift is not giving another way for antagonists reaffirm that Aristotle delayed evolutionary thinking, delayed as they used to say. It is not the same, not talking about essentials, but secondary characteristics that, as I understood, you said Aristotle recognized these differences, these small differences, and as occurred by environmental conditions or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But he said that this was not important for science. Science should prioritize the essential ones. So this is not munition for antagonists of Aristotle to say the same thing, that he delayed the evolutionary thinking.
Right. Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I think you put it exactly right. It's how you understand Aristotle's essentialism. It's not that he's not an essentialist. One of my mentors and a person I respect deeply, David Bohm, wrote a paper once called "Aristotle Was Not an Essentialist." But if you read that paper carefully, what he means is, at one point in that paper, he says he wants to dispense with three concepts that he says hover over philosophy like the three witches in Macbeth: substantia, essentia, and I can't remember what the third one was. But his point was these are medieval concepts. And I agree with him on that point. At one point in my paper on Aristotle and Darwin, I point out that there's no Greek word that you could translate essence. There are a whole bunch of words that do get translated essence, but they are all either based on participles of the verb to be, enai, or they're actually making use of the verb enai as a noun, to enai. That's being. And what Aristotle, I love the fact that he said this. He said, for living things, to be is to live. So for him, it's not, there aren't essential characteristics and accidental characteristics. There are characteristics that are fundamental to an organism's survival. And there are characteristics that he thinks are not. And he's got very good instincts here. At the beginning of the Generation of Animals, book 5, which is on non-essential differences, differences that don't make a difference to the animal's survival. Things like eye color. If a species has, like the human beings do, organisms of many different eye color, then apparently having a certain eye color isn't essential to your survival. So he has an essentialism, but it's that kind of essentialism. Why isn't it important to biology for him? Well, in a way it is. First of all, he devotes an entire book of the Generation of Animals to explaining those differences. So he doesn't think you can't explain them, but he doesn't think you can explain them by reference to function. He thinks these are functionally unimportant differences. Is it important to a human being whether he ends up being bald at the age of 50 or not? Apparently not. There were lots of bald Greeks around in their 70s and 80s that were doing just fine. Plato among them. So that was the way in which he made the difference. My point against the myth makers is that that's not the way they paint Aristotelian essentialism. It's this idea that it's basically Platonic forms that are implanted in individual organisms. You know, that's the eternal forms brought down to earth, if you like, and stuck inside the individual organisms. Aristotle's view is you figure out what's essential in the case of the study of living things by figuring out those features without which an organism cannot flourish. And those are the ones that you single out as the essential characteristics. And what he argued was when you get down below a certain level of division into things like the texture of hair and eye colors and so on, it'll differ from organism to organism. At one point in Generation of Animals, he says, eye color is not an essential characteristic unless all the organisms of a kind have it. Then he thinks that's evidence that maybe it is fundamental. So in various species of bird, it's absolutely fundamental that certain feathers be of a certain color. In others, it's not important. That's the way he makes the distinction between essence and accident, if you like. And it's also the case that unlike the picture that Elliot Sober paints of this, he wants to claim that if you're an Aristotelian, all these variations are deviations from type caused by some kind of mistake during biological development. And that's not the way Aristotle understands it at all. If you look at book 4 of the Generation of Animals, it's all about how, for example, a female offspring can look like the male parent, or offspring in one generation may not look like their parents, they may look more like their grandparents. And the male offspring may look like the mother, and the female offspring may look like the father, and so on and so forth. So he's all about explaining differences like that, and they're perfectly natural. He doesn't think they're deviations. That's the only way these things happen.
Okay, thank you. It's just retelling. Yeah, thank you.
No, it's a really good question, because you can even look at a lot of Aristotelian scholarship, especially scholarship that's focused primarily on the metaphysics and doesn't actually look at his science. That sounds very much like the Aristotelian of the myth.
I think Igor will make another question.
Yeah, Dr. Lennox mentioned the problem with the translation with the word essence, but you also mentioned the problem with several other words, the problem with translation, like psyche. I don't know if in English you say psyche or psyche. And in your other text in the philosophy of biology, in several moments you keep on writing the names in Greek to make sure that you're mentioning the correct words. So I was wondering, do you think these problems with translation from the Greek to other languages, does this play a major role in the building of this myth, or is a minor role? The translation issue, let's say.
I think it's a minor role, but I think there are certain things where I think you get a deeper understanding of what Aristotle is up to if you're careful in translating. I mean, a good example of this in my work, I get a lot of criticism from my Aristotelian colleagues about it. I refuse to translate eidos as species. The problem to start with is eidos is probably one of the most important concepts in Aristotelian philosophy. It's the basis of the matter-form distinction, for example. But it's also the one thing that he takes over from Plato in terms of terminology, but has a completely divergent view of what eidos signifies. Now, Aristotle has an entire book of the metaphysics devoted to, it's a kind of lexicon of all his important philosophical concepts. So it starts out, the first 5 chapters, I think, are his word arche, for starting point or first principle, aitia for cause, stoicheon for element, ananke for necessity. He has no entry for eidos. Now, the reason for that lexicon is every one of those words is used in more than one way. So the point of that lexicon is to indicate all the different ways in which these words can be used. This goes back, some of them are related, to go back to what y'all said, to the idea of a pros-hen equivocation, where there's one primary meaning of the term and then a number of other terms that are related to that primary meaning. If Aristotle thought that eidos had more than one sense, if he thought it had one meaning when we're talking about matter and form, and another meaning when we're talking about kinds and species, he would have told us so. He doesn't. But more importantly, I think you lose something if you translate that word species in certain contexts and form in other contexts. You lose what Aristotle saw as the intimate relationship between the two. I mean, what makes members of a group of organisms identical, in a sense, the same? What makes it the case that you can call, I don't know, all horses horses, is that they are one in form. They have the same form. And you lose that if you translate, when you're talking about horses, you say, oh, that's a species. And then when you're talking about an individual horse and you're saying, well, its parts are its matter and its capacity to function is its form, you would never know that it was the same word if it was translated species in the one case and form in the other case. And you would lose the fact that you call subdivisions of a genos, subdivisions of a kind, eidae, forms, because each of those, the individuals of each of those eidae, are one in form. So I think it's really crucial there that you translate the word form in all cases, and then explain that, well, sometimes, and I do this in both of these papers, I think, it's perfectly natural English, and I'm sure you can do the same thing in Portuguese, to talk about, for example, there are hawks, and then there are many forms of hawk. There are red-tailed hawks, there are peregrine hawks, there are, various kinds of hawks. And so I don't think you lose anything by just getting rid of species and genus from translating the Greek into English. And I think with being versus essence, the important there is the same word essence is used to translate 5 or 6 different Greek expressions in Aristotle. And I think every one of those expressions signifies something different. So again, I think you lose something by this practice of translating the what is it, the what it is to be, beingness, etc., in as if it was all the same word every time. Because I think Aristotle has something quite different in mind when he uses those expressions. He's got a reason why he doesn't use the same expression every time. Let's put it that way. So I think there's value in it, but I don't think the myth turns particularly on that. Ernst Mayr has a habit when he talks about Aristotle talks about Aristotle's essentialism of translating eidos as type. But that's because he wants to relate Aristotle to what he calls typology. And that's a way of allowing him to sort of equate what he calls typologists with Aristotelian essentialism. So.
Thiago wrote a more general question. It's a nice question because we are at the end of the academic year in Brazil, and we had like 7 meetings about Aristotle biology during this year. It's nice to make an evaluation of it.
Wow.
Do you want to ask the question, or do you want me to read it, Thiago? I think you...
do you listen to me now, or?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Yeah, I think that like it comes from the fact that I had philosophy at school. We learned about Aristotle, but I never knew that Aristotle was a biologist. That was never, no one ever told me that in school, in high school. And if we take like last week, we had this general exams that Brazilians have to take in order to go to college, kind of SATs or something like this. And if you see like the study sheets about Aristotle, they don't mention biology, right? It's taught, it's on the curriculum of schools, but biology is not part of it. It's ethics, politics, metaphysics. And how do you think like the recent works on Aristotle's biology influence both the academic view of Aristotle as a whole and how this flows into the general view of Aristotle?
Yeah, thank you, Thiago. So that's depressing. Because yeah. So let's take the 2 layers that you talked about. How does it influence the wider academic culture of Aristotelianism and philosophy? And then what about trickling down to the general culture and general education? I think there's been a very significant impact of the work that I and many others, including many of my students, have done on the Aristotelian biological corpus that has had a general influence on philosophy of biology. I can share this with you if it's not easily available to you, but Sophia Connell recently edited a Cambridge companion to Aristotle's biology. And it came out about 30 years after, yeah, that's it. Maria Lisa is showing it to you. And I wrote a sort of coda or epilogue to that, epilogue to that piece. And one of the things I did was sort of trace the development, sort of the penetration of studies of Aristotle's biology into studies of Aristotle more generally, starting with the book that Alan Godhelf and I edited back in 1987 called Philosophical Issues in Aristotle's Biology. One of the things I point out in that coda is our goal from the start was not to study Aristotle's biology. Our goal from the start was to focus on the biology for what it can teach us about Aristotle's philosophy. So what we did, and it was a rhetorical strategy on our part, was to get a whole bunch of very well-known philosophers, Aristotelian philosophers, to take a little of their time away from the ethics and the metaphysics and the logic and actually look at the biology. So if you look at the people publishing in that volume, there's lots of big name Aristotelians in there, like R.E.A. Cosman and John Cooper and so on, who actually hadn't looked at Aristotle's biology at all until we kind of goaded them into doing it. But from that point on, there's a huge growth in the number of references to Aristotle's biology in Aristotelian scholarship generally. And now, if you look at, first of all, there's now a Cambridge companion to Aristotle's biology. And if you look at any of the companions to Aristotle's biology that have come out over the last 10 years, they always have at least one chapter on Aristotle's biology. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy asked me to do an article on Aristotle's biology, not on his philosophy, on his biology. So there has been real penetration at that level, I think. One of the reasons I'm shifting away from that kind of work and focusing more on sort of talking to philosophers of science and philosophers of biology generally about Aristotle is because of what you say. It hasn't penetrated further down than that as much as I would like it to. And I viewed my whole career as far as Aristotle is concerned. I have a separate career on Darwin. I focused my whole career on trying to get a wider and deeper appreciation of Aristotle's study of living things. And so the fact that it hasn't worked its way sort of down into the general public is something I'm constantly. I wrote a letter to the editor of The Economist about a month ago because they had a 5-part series in The Economist, sort of updating their readers on the current state of biology. And it was really good. I mean, it was really well done. They did 5 different essays on different parts of biology. And when they got to evolution and systematics, the way they talked about Aristotle reflected the fact that whoever wrote that article hadn't read any of the literature on Aristotle's biology. And there's now a ton of it out there for people to read. So I just felt I had to write a letter to the editor, which they published to their great credit. Of course, as always with letters to the editor, they took out a whole lot of the letter that I thought was the best part of it, and watered it down considerably. They didn't want it to be as critical of their writer as I in fact was. So they took out a lot of the criticisms and just left all the positive stuff about Aristotle. But that's fine. Okay. But I really, I think you're right. It hasn't gotten to the point where everybody appreciates that Aristotle really was not only, I would argue, the founder of the science of biology, but one of the really great biologists. I mean, Darwin read him and thought he was great. Robert Owen read him and thought he was great. Every modern biologist that I know of that's actually read him carefully is blown away by what he accomplished. but it's getting people to read him and read the scholarship about him that's the hard part once you get outside of the general realm of ancient philosophy, I think. That's a good question.
Professor Roberto Martins.
Professor Lennox, I'd like to ask you a question concerning one of your citations of Aristotle in your Aristotle and Darwin paper at the second page. The citation beginning, nature makes nothing in vain.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think, I wonder, why did you choose this citation when we are trying to show similarities between Darwin and Aristotle? And this seems to me a point of difference because perfect adaptation is not one of Darwin's ideas. In evolutionary theory, it's important to point out that organisms are not perfectly adapted, and this is because they change. For instance, vestigial organs. And in the case of Aristotle, I wonder if there is any place for vestigial organs and things like that. Of course, he knew things like the eyes of the mole, which are do not work. But now, but I think Aristotle makes a lot of it's very important for him, this idea that nature makes nothing in vain.
Yep.
And so how can we understand imperfect organs in Aristotle's view?
Yeah, good. Very good question. I mean, it's really a two-part question. The first part is, why did I choose that quote? I chose the quote because if you just took out selection and just said, although nature can act only through and for the good of each being, and then you compare that to nature always makes from among the possibilities that which is best for the being of each kind of animal. The two passages sound very, very similar. Now notice, all I'm claiming there is that they sound very similar. First of all, there's a teleological focus in both of them. Natural selection acts through and for the good of each being. Nature always makes from among the possibilities, notice from among the possibilities, not without qualification, that which is best for the being of each kind of animal. So I just chose them because they sound similar, not because in fact they're making the same point. But can Aristotle deal with the imperfections in the world, so to speak? Yes. And I think I want to divide my answer into two parts. First of all, Aristotle is not, as Stephen Jay Gould would put it, a Panglossian adaptationist. Two good places to look on this subject. One is chapter 2 of book 4 of the Parts of Animals. He's talking about a particular thing there, but he then generalizes the point he's making. He's talking about the presence of bile in organisms. And he's done a lot of study of organisms that seem to have a lot of bile production and organisms that don't, and variations within kinds of organisms about the amount of bile that he finds on dissection, he comes to the conclusion that bile is an incidental byproduct, that it's not actually good for organisms at all. And in fact, organisms that have less of it seem to do better than organisms that have more of it. And he thinks there are kinds of organisms that don't have any bile production, and he thinks they live longer than organisms that do. So he's making a specific point about bile, but then he says, in general, you shouldn't always look for a adaptive function for structure. That's my language, not his. Shouldn't always look for that for the sake of which in all living things. It says sometimes things are just byproducts that are there as byproducts of something else that was produced. So it's not that they're, it's not like the mole's covering of the mole's eyes, where Aristotle thinks that probably in that case, there's some kind of developmental cause of that. But it's something, he thinks there are a lot of things that aren't there for any biological purpose. And he thinks there are a lot of different ways in which they can come about. So he can certainly explain that kind of thing. Now, vestigial organs, that's a different story. He wouldn't have any, I think, reason to think they were vestigial. So he has to come up with an explanation for why the organism has them, given that they don't seem to serve any adaptive function for the organism. And I think typically what he will do is say that they're a byproduct of something else that was produced. In order for him to come up with a story about vestigial organs, he'd have to get some kind of evolutionary thinking going. And to his credit, you know, there were evolutionary thinkers before him. Anaxagoras and Empedocles both seem to think that organisms came into being at some point in time and produced other organisms at a later point in time. But he thought that was just wild speculation, that they had no evidence at all for the claims they were making. I'm inclined to agree with him. They were making up cosmological stories about the origins of life, and they didn't really have any good evidence for the stories they were telling. So, but yeah, he can deal with the non-adaptive structures in organisms, but he can't deal with them by claiming that they're vestigial.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I would have a question, but as we are talking about difference, diversity, and plurality, I don't want to make a monopoly here. So perhaps someone who have not yet talked wants to ask a question. Well, in the meantime, we really do appreciate your works on the role of teleology in biology. So regarding Professor Martin's question, do you think that a common trait between Aristotle's and Darwin's biology is that they are teleological biologists, even if in different senses of teleology, of course?
Yeah. It definitely is a different kind of teleology. There's no question about that. And again, one of the myths that I didn't deal with in the Aristotle and Darwin paper is the myth that he's not a teleologist, or as David Hull once put it, for all intents and purposes, Darwin killed teleology stone cold dead. um, Michael Gieselin got extremely angry with me for laying out all the evidence that Darwin definitely did believe in teleology. And I enjoyed that interaction very much. A friend of mine in the philosophy of biology, after Gieselin wrote the response to my paper, sent me a letter and said, "Welcome to the club. You're not really a philosopher of biology until you've been attacked by Michael Gieselin." So I think the common thread in the teleology in the two thinkers is an appreciation for, as we would say, adaptation. An appreciation for the fact that biological structures, not all of them, but many of them, appear to be, I don't like to use this word, but I will just as a shorthand, designed for a particular function. And that there seems to be an integration of those adaptations around an organism's way of life. So it's not just that a particular kind of eye is for a particular kind of seeing, and a particular kind of wing is for a particular kind of flying, and a particular kind of beak is for a particular kind of eating. It's that in any particular kind of bird, all of those structural features will be designed so they work together. That's what functional morphology as a science is all about, is showing how all of the adaptations are coordinated so that they work as a whole to suit the lifestyle of the organism. I think Darwin had a deep appreciation for that. And I think Aristotle had a deep appreciation of that. And I think one of the reasons when Darwin finally read On the Parts of Animals near the end of his life, and it is a kind of, for me, who studies both of them sort of equally, a kind of tragic tale that Darwin only gets around to reading Aristotle a month or so before he dies. I think if the part of the parts of animals that he read is basically a philosophical defense of a teleological understanding of living things, and then Darwin apparently read the first 4 or 5 chapters of book 2. And the first 2 chapters really of book 2 is how the different uniform parts are teleologically for the sake of the non-uniform parts, the organs, and how the organs are for the sake of the flourishing of the whole animal. I think that was one of the things that he really appreciated in Aristotle when he read him, was that teleological vision of the natural world. But of course, Darwin thinks he has a deeper explanation for adaptation. Aristotle just, I think, takes it as a basic, fundamental fact that he has to make a case for. He has to argue for the fundamental fact, but I think he takes it as a fundamental fact that biological structures and activities are for the sake of the functions they perform, and that biological activity is goal-directed, and that biological development is goal-directed. I think that's just, rock bottom explanatory base for Aristotle. Whereas Darwin thinks that organisms are well adapted due to the actions of natural selection. Now, having said that, I'm going to take one more step on the Darwinian side here and point out that the way Darwin, and I'll give you some modern examples of the same thing, but the way Darwin approaches that subject, that is natural selection and adaptation. Natural selection, metaphorically, is ranging over variations in a population all the time. As populations are varying with respect to every characteristic. And it's the value of a particular variation that allows it to get differentially passed on to the next generation in comparison with the other variations. So there's already what I would call teleological variation in a population prior to natural selection. That's one of the things where I think you need to have a basically Aristotelian point of view in order for natural selection to make sense, if you like. You have to have this idea that in a population of organisms, the organisms are varying with respect to how well they're surviving and flourishing in that environment. And that's the background to natural selection actually working. I think there's a kind of what I would call proto-teleology prior to the workings of natural selection. A good example of this in a contemporary work is, probably all of you know about the work that Peter and Rosemary Grant did on the finch populations in the Galapagos Islands. They studied them for about 40 years before they finally passed on the work to their graduate students. If you look at their publications, they will talk about the adaptations of the finches in the different populations. For example, when there is a drought and certain kinds of food become non-available and other kinds of food remain available during the drought. And they'll talk about natural selection preferring the birds, the finches that could eat the food that's still available and selecting against the ones that preferred the food that was no longer available. And it often had to do with the size of the beak and the hardness of the beak. Now, this isn't natural selection the way neo-Darwinians talk about it, because one of the things that happens during these droughts is reproduction stops. These birds don't reproduce. They go on for a couple of years, not reproducing because they're giving all their energy to staying alive. They're not producing eggs. And yet the populations change dramatically from having a full range of variation of beak size to all of them being ones with larger than average beaks. And because the males tend to have larger than average beaks, the population ratio between males and females changes dramatically from one year to the next. But there's no reproduction. But they call it natural selection because the organisms that are designed to flourish better in those drought situations are surviving, and the ones that aren't are the ones that are dying off. So they're calling it natural selection, but in fact, it's not natural selection in the sense of which organisms are passing on the most genes from one generation to the next. There's no passing on. Now, there will be passing on of just that kind after the drought passes and they start reproducing again. but they're talking about selection ranging over the current population. They're not talking about the number of genes that get differentially passed on from one generation to the next. I think in that respect, it's more like Aristotle than people maybe tend to think. But still, natural selection changes everything. There's no question about that.
Thank you. Maria-Alice, do you want to read?
Yeah, I just remember something we discussed in a previous meeting of ours. That is why we can't find any mention in Aristotle, until, as far as I know, about fossils or petrified trees. I can suppose that he stumbled on them in Greece. I don't know. I'm not sure about it, but it's something it is strange that we can find these objects of nature in his books.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't have any good answer to that. The one thing that I can say is that Aristotle is not alone. There is very little reference to fossils in ancient Greece. Now, one thing I think, there's sort of two historical facts that I think are important background to this puzzle. One is nobody understood fossils as representatives of previously existing organisms that no longer exist until maybe the 16th century is the first suggestions of that. There were a lot of other explanations. When you had a very simple-minded view of how reproduction works, I know there was one view in the medieval period that fossils were due to semen getting of different kinds of animals getting scattered in the soil instead of being used to impregnate another organism. And what it did was create the outward appearance of the organism in the ground. So, I mean, the bottom line is there really was no good discussion of fossils. And the first I know of is Kesselpino in the 16th century, Robert Hooke in the early 17th century. So I think part of the reason for that is until you actually know what you're looking for, a lot of things that we think of as fossils could be anything. You know, to think of them as, oh, that's a previously existing, I mean, supposing you've never seen a trilobite, which nobody has, right? You come across something that we would call the fossil of a trilobite. But why would you think that's what it was if you didn't know of the pre-existence of these ancient forms of organisms? I mean, there's a kind of weird loop where you have to know what you're looking for. It's a Meno problem, basically. It's a Plato's Meno problem. How do you identify a thing if you don't know what it is you're looking for? You know, but then don't you have to know what it is to go looking for it? So there's two things. One, there's very little reference to anything that we would consider fossils in any of the ancient scientific literature. And B, even when people start noticing them, they're like, fossil originally just means something dug up out of the ground. And people would stick them next to various kinds of gemstones and, things like that. So I think there has to be a kind of historical vision of life on Earth of a certain kind before people can actually recognize fossils as the remnants of formerly living organisms. Aristotle certainly didn't.
Thank you.
Once again, I would have a question, but I want to leave it open if anyone who hasn't talked yet want to make a question. Otherwise, I would like to ask you about the individual characteristic of living beings and of substances for Aristotle, right? This impresses me a lot as a parallel that make us to think that really Aristotle's metaphysics have something of biology in it, the singularity of each living being, and we can think in the metaphysics that the primary substances are always individuals, right? And I really appreciate it when you talk about the organism as the irreducible locus of explanation, right? You had already indicated Walsh's text. I haven't read it yet on the agency, but I was wondering about the term of organism, because it is really interesting that organon for Aristotle is an instrument. We know that this is the name of his treatises on logic, but as an instrument, and I think you translate organica as an instrumental thing, right? And we know that, so from instrument, we have the organ of living beings, and from there we come to organism or organic. And for some authors in philosophy of biology, this is the distinct trait of Kant, for instance, for Immanuel Kant, or for 18th, 19th century biology that will have a focus on organism. But what do you think about the term? First of all, a naive question. Do you know when the term organism comes by? It seems to me to be a more modern term after 17th or 18th century. And on the other hand, not just the term, but do you think that Aristotle sees some connection between organon as an instrument and the organical aspect of a living being, if we can say so, through function, perhaps?
The easy question is the second one. I would say absolutely. He often refers to the parts of animals as organa, as organs. And the word that we translate functions, sometimes ergon, is closely related etymologically to organon. It means something like working or functioning. It's the work done by an instrument, if you like. And partly this comes from Aristotle's constant use of technological metaphors for living things. So often when he's explaining biological teleology, he'll use technological examples. So he'll say, the saw is for the sake of sawing, not sawing for the sake of the saw. His point is that the instrument is for the sake of the function it performs and not the other way around. So he uses those kinds of examples all the time, where he's taking what I think it's a particular example of his view that knowledge progresses by going from what's more familiar to us to what's more familiar in the nature of things. And he thinks if he's explaining biological teleology to people, it will be easier for them to get it if he starts with a technological, a tool that they're all familiar with. and then says, see, the eye is like that. It's an organ. So yes, he does use the language of organ as an instrument, if you like, a biological instrument. And he even goes so far as to say the whole body is an instrument for the soul. Now, when does the language of, well, there's two things about the history. One is it's somewhat anachronistic of me to use that language in talking about Aristotle's biology. But I allowed myself to do it because I was really talking about an Aristotelian philosophy of biology and not Aristotle's. It's anachronistic because a number of people have pointed out Aristotle, technically speaking, doesn't actually have a biology. He does zoology. His good friend Theophrastus does botany. Theophrastus writes a treatise on the causes of the parts of plants and a history of plants that's clearly modeled on Aristotle's history of animals and parts of animals. They work together very closely. Most of Aristotle's life after he left Plato's Academy, he was working with Theophrastus, and Theophrastus took over as the head of his school after he died. So between the two of them, you might say they had biology, but neither of them ever uses the word biologia. It's a Greek root, so they could have, but they don't. But he didn't use the word zoology either. He didn't talk about zoologia. So using the language of biology and organism and so on is definitely using more modern language to talk about Aristotle's. I justified it a few times in print because people have criticized me for talking about Aristotle's biology. And I said, well, look, what does biology do? Biology tries to get a general understanding of living things empirically and then form explanations for the general knowledge that they've accumulated. And that's what Aristotle is trying to do, and he's trying to do it very self-consciously. It's true that he's demarcating the subject of animals particularly, rather than animals and all other kinds of living things, which would only have been animals and plants in his case. So it seems to me he's doing biology. I think I'm pretty sure biology was either coined by Kant or right around the time of Kant. The same goes for teleology. Again, it could have been a Greek expression. Telos and logos are both Greek words, but I don't think teleology was coined before Kant. I'm not sure about organism. I'm not sure when that word comes into being. Certainly, Lamarck uses the term biology, but a lot of people insist that there really isn't a science of biology until sometime after Darwin. Darwin didn't consider himself a biologist. He never calls himself that. He sometimes calls himself a naturalist. Until he published The Origin, almost everybody would have said he was a geologist, because nearly everything he published prior to On the Origin of Species, well, he did a large bunch of treatises on the barnacles, But other than that, most of what he published prior to the origin was on geology. So somebody just posted something on the history of
the
biology.
term, yes. I know there is a paper by McLaughlin from 2002, and he
Yeah.
says that in 1766 it was used in Latin, biologia, by Christian Hanoff.
Yeah.
But he says that since the 17th century, it's interesting. He says biologia in Latin was what we call a biografia. When a saint or an as important person would die, there would be a biologia in 17th century. So there is the term in Latin, but of course is another thing, right? And yeah, I think 1802 is for Lamarck and Treviranus. Yeah.
Yeah.
But regarding organism, I think it's really funny and even ironic, because today we talk about organism thinking about the really particularity of what is living being, or even we talk about organic food as a natural thing. And finally, it comes from an analogy from the technological to the natural from Aristotle, right? It's really ironic.
I didn't respond to the other part, the first part of your question, by the way, which is on the individual being as sort of the primary being in Aristotle. That's actually a controversial issue. In the categories, Aristotle distinguishes between primary being and secondary being, sometimes called substance, ousia. Ousia is just based on a participle of the verb to be. So I prefer substantial being or being. He calls primary being the individual horse and the individual man, and he calls things like horse and human being secondary being. But in the metaphysics, especially in metaphysics book Zeta, there seems to be a dialogue going on throughout the entire book Zeta between one of the protagonists in the debate claiming that it's the composite being, like Socrates or Coriscus, that's the primary being, or it's the form of the composite that's the primary being. And you could dig up passages that seem to claim that the form that is shared by Socrates and Coriscus and other human beings is the primary being, and other passages where he seems to say, oh no, it's the individual composite of the form and matter that's the primary being. I don't think this actually gets resolved in book Zeta. I don't think it gets resolved until the end of book Eta, book 8. The very last chapter, he seems to say that there is a kind of identity between matter and form when you're talking about a fully realized being. He says the only difference is that the matter is potentiality and the form is actuality. But he says that in the very context of saying that they're not really different. They're like one and the same thing. So you can read that one of two ways. You can read that as saying that the composite individual, like Socrates, is primary. But you can also read Aristotle as saying, yes, that's true, but it's because of the form of the composite that the composite is primary being. So I think the metaphysics is more complicated and difficult on that subject than the categories. The categories seems to say straightforwardly, primary being or primary substance is the individual human being, the individual horse. And there's a well-known paper by G.E.L. Owen called The Platonism of Aristotle, where what he claims is Aristotle in his early middle age is a renegade out to sort of reject everything that Plato ever said. And that's when he writes the categories and says, no, it's the individual perceptible thing. That's the real being, not your silly forms. Forms are just secondary substances. And then he gets to the metaphysics and he starts thinking about change and how to explain substantial change. And he finally agrees with Plato in a sense that form is more being than the individual composite of matter and form. I don't buy that, but I understand you can find texts that seem to make that claim. I will say Aristotle over and over again says that however you understand form, he says repeatedly and unequivocally, universals do not exist except in the soul. So if you understand forms as universals, Aristotle seems to be quite clear that forms in that sense don't exist. The only way forms exist, universals exist, is as universal concepts in the human soul. So if you understand the argument of the metaphysics as claiming that form is primary being, it can't be form in the sense of some kind of universal. It has to be form in some other sense.
Thank you.
João?
Yeah.
I think we are on time. I just would like to ask you a final question, and you don't really need to respond it now. You can answer by email later. We would like to know, João and I, we are thinking in creating a discipline at Institute of Bioscience in Aristotle biology. So we would like to know what you think about it, to make a course for undergrads and graduate students in biology, if it is worthy for them, and if you would like to participate, since we have now this distant tool we have, at least in one or another moment of the course.
Yeah, so I'll answer quickly now, and we can talk more about it by email as we go forward. But the answer is yes. I think it's a wonderful idea, and I would be happy to participate. And I hope someday that I don't have to participate only at a distance like this. It would be. I love Brazil. I love Brazilian music. I love the Brazilian culture, and.
Yeah.
I would love to get back there someday, but unfortunately, right now, it seems to be a very bad idea.
Yeah.
both politically and from a health standpoint.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we really hope to have you here. We said São Paulo is not the nicest place in Brazil, but as we grown up here, we know the nice places in São Paulo, so it would be really nice even though to have you here.
Of course.
And
I live in Pittsburgh, so I'm very familiar with an industrial city.
That's it. We will send you, Maria Alice, do you want to tell him already what we will send? Maria Alice had this idea, as you said, you like the Brazilian music. We gather around a playlist of Brazilian music, so each one of the participants of the group, right, Maria Alice, had it, and we'll send it to you as a thank you for your great participation and availability.
What a lovely idea. I would love that.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everybody. This was a lot of fun. You asked great, wonderful questions, and I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Professor Lennox. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Professor.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Obrigada, Roberto.
Thank you, Professor.